Hey everyone, Tin Man here, and today we're going to be talking about a highly requested topic, unit positioning. When preparing this video, I realized there is a lot to talk about in regards to positioning, so I've split this into two parts. In this video, I'll cover the higher level concepts like zone of control, focus fire, and ability geometry, and in part 2, I'll cover more specific examples, as well as discuss how to counter opposing strategies and positionings. The way you position your units on the board is very important to improving your play and increasing your win rate. That being said, in my previous guides, I covered gold management and the basics of composition building before getting to positioning because I feel that those topics are much more important for newer players to learn and understand first. If you've not watched those guides, please do go check them out, link in the description below. With that in mind, let's jump into the details of optimal positioning. The first and probably most important concept to cover is zones of control. A zone of control is essentially the squares from the opposing side that could target your unit. In the simplest case, when you have only one unit, its zone of control is the entire opposing board. All opposing units will target it no matter what. If you have two units positioned in the middle like this, then they split the board in half. Any opposing units on the left will target Axe, and any opposing units on the right will target Tiny. There are some complications to this though, due to the somewhat random nature of movement and targeting. If I have a unit on the front line, but the opposing unit is not on the front line, say offset a few squares back, then there is some variation in whether that unit will target our left unit or our right unit. Units in this blue region could target either Axe or Tiny, especially if that unit is ranged. The closer the units are to each other, the more predictable the fight will be in terms of who targets whom. The further units are away, the more chaotic and unpredictable it becomes. So how do we use this concept of zones of control to our advantage? Let's take a look at a typical formation. In this example, we have 5 units. 3 of them are still 1-star, and 2 of them are 2-star. What are the zones of control for each unit? Just to simplify, let's ignore the randomness as units get further away. Clockwork has all of this blue region, Tusk has the red, Slardar has orange, Timbersaw green, and Axe pink. As we can see, Axe has the largest zone of control, Clockwork has the second largest, and each of our other units in the middle have a much smaller zone. If we assume that opposing units are randomly distributed, which is a somewhat reasonable assumption given that in the early game we have 7 opponents with 7 different formations, then the size of the zone of control directly correlates to the number of opponents that will attack the unit. So in this situation, we put our most resilient units, our 2-star units, on the edge so that they will have the largest zones of control and thus, on average, will have more opposing units targeting them. This seems a little bit odd, right? That the safest place may actually be front and center in this formation. That's why we put Slardar there, who deals high damage, but since he's not 2-star, he's vulnerable. The most dangerous place in this formation is actually on the edge. For example, if an opponent was stacked into the pink corner, then they will all focus fire on a 2-star Axe. That is Axe's job after all, to take focus fire from the enemy. But if we put Slardar or any of our 1-star units on that edge, they would get melted before they have any chance to deal damage. This type of formation can be countered if your opponent stacks in the middle, but I'll discuss more about counter formations in part 2 of this guide. In this example, all of our units are relatively resilient, with warriors and inventors, so we do not worry too much about putting them up front. That risks them taking damage, but also lets them get into combat faster and thus dealing more damage. But what if we have units that we do not want to risk on the front lines? Let's take a look at another example. Here we have a similar frontline setup with our most tanky units on the edge and our higher DPS in the middle, but we also have Anti-Mage positioned directly behind Axe. Anti-Mage is a melee unit, but he has low health and no bonus armor like the warriors do. Most of his value comes from his passive, which burns opposing mana, preventing them from casting their abilities. By positioning him just behind Axe, we minimize the chances that any opponents target him initially, instead targeting the more resilient warriors. This comes at the cost of a longer time for him to get into combat as he has to walk around. If we wanted to be really safe, we could place him all the way on the back line, but then he would spend a lot of time walking forward. By putting him just behind our front line, on the side that has the biggest zone of control, we strike a nice balance of keeping him safe, but also getting him into combat quickly. The other uses of zones of control is to manipulate mana gain. Units gain mana based on the damage they deal and the damage they take. The more damage either way, then the more mana they gain and the faster they can cast their abilities. In the early game, this means that some ranged units, like Tinker, can be placed in the front line to quickly gain mana, since most of his value is in the high damage of his ability and not in his auto attacks. Later in the game, this encourages you to put units that have high impact abilities in front to quickly cast them as soon as possible. Tidehunter and Disruptor are 2 of the most common units used like this. Many late game fights can be won or lost based on who uses their ability first. If our Tidehunter triggers first, it will disable the opposing units long enough to finish them off before any of them can cast, leading to a massive win in our favor. By placing Tidehunter front with a large zone of control, you can ensure that it gains mana quickly and thus casts quickly. This can be a bit dangerous though, since if that unit is wiped out too quickly, then all is wasted. That is why in this example we have a babysitter, Kunkka, right next to it, to draw some of the opposing attacks away to ensure that Tidehunter can survive long enough to gain mana and cast. This is a delicate balance, and heavily depends on your units, their star level, their defensive items, and your opponent's lineup. So if you notice that your unit is dying too quickly before casting, adjust positioning and maybe move someone else up there to help protect them. The next major concept I want to discuss is kind of the reverse of zones of control. Not only can positioning determine what enemies target your units, but also which units your units target on the enemy side. A great example of using this to your advantage is the typical formation for hunters, where they are in a straight line down one of the sides of the board. By positioning in an extreme formation like this, you can almost ensure that all of your ranged units will target the same enemy, either someone right in front of them or whoever is on the edge of the opponent's formation. This type of focus fire brings a lot of benefits. A slightly damaged opposing unit deals the same damage and uses their abilities just the same as if they were at full health. But if an opponent is at 0%, they are eliminated and can't hurt you anymore. So dealing 100% damage to a single target is much more useful than dealing 10% to 10 different targets. By focus firing on a single target, you eliminate them quickly and then can move on to the next target. If you spread it out too evenly, then your opponent gets to do all of their damage and all of their abilities by the end of the fight. Of course, this creates a problem for our front line, right? I mean, look at how big Axe's zone of control is here. Almost every opposing unit will be targeting him. If our backline has to be off to the side to focus fire, and we want to protect them from enemies who are directly in front of them, then we also need our front line off to the side. But when our front line's off to the side, that means that somebody's going to be on the edge, Axe in this case, and that means they're going to have a huge zone of control, allowing our opponents to focus fire our front line even if they're not in a focus fire type formation. So we could add more frontliners, say add somebody to the right of Axe, but that won't really fix the problem. It'll just, push the issue down the line to our next frontliner. So how do we fix this? Remember how I mentioned that the further away that the units are from each other, the more chaotic and less predictable a fight becomes. If we offset the edge of our front line by, say, putting Pudge like here, we increase the distance between the edge of our front line and the enemies, allowing the zones of control for Axe and Pudge to blend together a bit more. We intentionally introduce randomness to prevent the opponent from focus firing on our front line. Essentially, the enemies in the blue region will have a 50-50 shot of targeting Axe or Pudge, increasing the survivability of both of them. This type of offset can work well in all melee lineups as well. When you offset your damage dealers, say Slarder, Doom, Lycan, off the line back one spot. This means that opposing units will split their attention between your damage dealers and a tank. In this case, they would split between Axe and Lycan, or between Pudge and Doom if they're stacked in those corners, giving a bit more survivability to both Lycan and Doom. The last topic I want to discuss today is the geometry of your abilities. Some units have single target abilities that target at random, such as Doom, and positioning does not really matter for these units. But there are plenty of units who do have an effect on your positioning. The most popular one right now is the Knights Alliance. The Knights gain a damage reduction shield that increases when they are adjacent to at least one other Knight. This promotes a box type formation as shown here. By positioning with 3 Knights up front and 1 directly behind in the middle, it ensures that losing any one Knight will not mess up your synergy. If instead we did a line formation like this, then losing one of the Knights, say Chaos Knight, would leave someone else, like Bat Rider, without your Knight buff. There are other effects that we need to consider in the shape though, not just Knights. Some other units have similar type effects, such as Drow Ranger, affecting units adjacent. Timbersaw and Juggernaut have circular AoE effects, and even Necrophos with his Death Pulse has a circular type effect. In general, these units need to be placed roughly central within your formation. If they're placed near the edge, then some of their value will be lost because they're not affecting as many units as possible. We can see how Necrophos is roughly centered in this formation here. Looking at a more complete Hunter formation, we see that Drow Ranger is near the middle for maximum effect. The other geometry to consider is straight line abilities, mainly Wind Ranger, Keeper of the Light, and Puck. These units are almost always placed in the corner of the board. By placing them here, you limit the possible directions that they can shoot their straight line ability to a 90-degree angle. All opposing units will be within that arc. If instead they are placed, say, like this, and they have near the middle, they have a full 360 degrees to shoot. If an opposing assassin jumps behind them, they may shoot their ability backwards and only hit one target. But by placing in the corner, you limit that possibility and increase the number of opponents that are hit. This also applies to Beastmaster to some extent. While not placed in the corner, he's placed on the edge to maximize edge of the front line to maximize his effectiveness and maximize the chance that his ability goes to the most possible enemy units. So that's it for part 1 of this positioning guide. To quickly recap, unit targeting is based off zones of control. The closer units are to each other, the more likely they are to target each other. This means that the most dangerous spot is often on the edges of lines, since they can be focus fired by opponents in an opposite corner. We can use these zones of control to quickly gain mana on key units by letting them take a lot of damage. It can be risky though, so having an extra unit there is advisable. By stacking in corners, we can abuse the zones of control to focus fire on opposing units. We can offset our front line too to avoid opposing focus fire. Finally, consider the geometry of your abilities and passives to maximize their effectiveness. In the next video, I'll cover how to use positioning to adapt and counter opposing strategies. I'll cover some interesting and unique scenarios, as well as some more late game examples. If you found this guide helpful, please do like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you can keep up to date with all of my Dota Underlords content and catch part 2 as soon as it's out. Thanks for watching.